It's been 61 years since JFK was assassinated, and it is very much possible for 61 years Americans have been lied to about his murder. On the next episode, I speak with Jefferson Morley.
Was the CIA atrociously incompetent when it came to the alleged lone gunman? Or was Angleton actually running a counterintelligence operation involving him? And
Okay.
I believe it's the latter.
Jeff believes the evidence he has been collecting for many years shows that JFK was killed by enemies in his own government who had the ability to cover it up. He believes the CIA knows this, which is why for 61 years they have not released all the JFK assassination files. Where does this podcast find you?
Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
3 miles
I
from the White House.
I'm very grateful for you to be here. I have my production assistant on here too in the background. So if there's anything you want to pull up, he will be able to hopefully do that. Um, I came across you when I was watching Breaking Point with
Uh-huh.
Sagar,
Uh-huh.
and when you were throwing in your plugs, and I said I have to get in contact with Jeff. Uh, so I apologize. I won't be able to give you a 4 minute introduction like Jesse Waters was able to.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do know that you are a veteran journalist. You've been studying the JFK files for many years,
Mhm.
and I'm very grateful for you to be here. Um, and I know we could jump right into the JFK stuff
Mhm.
because Americans have been smelling bullshit on this for the past 60 years.
Mhm.
Uh, so hopefully we could get to the truth, but I just want to take a step back and understand uh, how did you get into journalism? And I asked that question because I've always been fascinated by journalists, and I think every humans in general have this innate ability to want to seek the truth, to find it. And I think journalists are the closest things to it because they're on the ground doing all the groundwork.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you could tell us a little bit about that, how did you get into the journalism?
Um, well, thanks for asking that because I don't get that question often, and it's relevant to what I do. I mean, I was very lucky. I knew from about the time I was 17 that I was going to be a newspaper reporter and a journalist. And I reached that conviction. And, I mean, really, I've had very few non-journalism jobs in my life. Even all in my summer jobs, it was usually at a publication. I was usually writing for a publication. In college, I was on the newspaper. When I got out of college, I went right in. So I knew right away that I wanted to do it. Why did I want to do it so badly? Well, I just like telling stories. I like telling stories that people didn't know. And that was really the root of it. And I enjoyed reporting. It's a it's a difficult art. You have to know how to talk to people, and you have to know how to listen. And that's maybe the harder part, or the part that journalists don't do. Um, so yeah, so I always wanted to do journalism. And then when I came to Washington in the early 80s, when I got out of school and went into got my first jobs in journalism at the New Republic and the Nation, the biggest stories in Washington politics were the civil wars in Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the role of Cuba in those revolutions, and the role of the CIA in our own counter revolutions. And about that story, you had to write about the CIA. And it was very difficult. I was this 20 something guy in Washington. I didn't have a security clearance. I didn't have any experience in an intelligence agency. I didn't have any friends who worked at the CIA. So how could you get up to speed that? Well, a resourceful reporter figures out ways. And I listened to some older guys and they said, well, here's what you do, Jeff. They said, here's a bunch of declassified records. from the CIA in Central America. Now, they're not from today. This was in the 80s. They might have been from the 60s or the 70s. They said, well, look for names of CIA officers in there. There'll be a few. Some of them will be fake, but some of them will be real, or State Department people. And they'll be retired by now. Call them up, show them this document, and say what was going on. And just play dumb. Just let them explain it to you. And that's how I got to know the CIA. Just what's in this document? How does the document work? What does it mean that it was addressed to him? What's the code name? Why the date? Why the timestamp? And eventually I learned a lot about how CIA operations worked and wrote a lot about the CIA in El Salvador, CIA support for the death squads there, CIA support for death squads in Guatemala, CIA support for the Contras, and then that blossomed into the Iran-Contra affair, which I was, right at the forefront of reporting on. And so, that was my introduction to journalism, and that was my introduction to the JFK story. Okay, I did not come to the JFK story through the literature of conspiracy. I came through it through a understanding of CIA operations in the Western Hemisphere. And so that's a very different lens to look at the story. I wasn't chasing conspiracy theories. I wasn't seeking to vindicate or refute them. There were a lot of theories, and I had a bunch of them, and I changed my mind a lot of times. And I never wrote about it because I don't write about theories. I write about facts. So, and when the JFK Records Act was passed in 1992, in response to Oliver Stone's movie, Congress said, let's declassify all the records, right? People said, oh, Oliver Stone, you bad boy, how dare you criticize the Warren Commission? And Oliver responded with a heavyweight punch to the jaw of the establishment. If you're not hiding anything, why are 95% of the records related to Kennedy's assassination still classified 30 years after the fact? That fact, pointed out by Stone, resulted in a deluge of mail to Capitol Hill, and Congress did the right thing. They unanimously passed the JFK Records Act and said, we're going to make all public all of our records. And it's a good law. And they created a real structure to make sure that it worked, that the CIA couldn't control the process. And so in the 1990s, we started getting the first real full historical record, all the documents related to the assassination, to the investigation of the assassination, to the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, to information about other people who might have been involved. All of that first started to come into the record in 1993, 1994. So that was 30 years after the assassination. And when that happened, I knew a lot about CIA operations. I knew a lot about the CIA in the Western Hemisphere. And I knew a lot about the role of Cuba in American politics and the CIA. And so I came to the JFK story and this huge batch of new records with a lot of knowledge. And when that law was passed, I realized right away there was a gold mine of material coming my way. And sure enough, that proved to be true. And so the JFK story was this rich vein, pretty much unknown. I'm not unknown, not well understood, certainly not the CIA role and the events that led to the assassination. And so here was a chance to write about that in detail and without reference to the perennial and often tedious debate about conspiracy. I was just writing about new things in the record, and these were cool stories, as everybody agreed. And so I published a number of them in the Washington Post and have published a number of them elsewhere. And now that's kind of the foundation of my JFK Facts newsletter on Substack.
There's so much to unpack from all of that.
Yeah.
You having to work, looking at CIA files from a younger age, and so I guess my follow-up is when the CIA released the files in 1992, uh, why were why was so much stuff redacted? What were they hiding at the time that we're finding out now?
So what the JFK Records Act did was it created this independent board. And this is why it was a good law, because it took the final decision about the declassification of a document out of the hands of the agency. if you let the CIA decide when this thing's going to become public, it'll never become public. And if you rely on the Freedom of Information Act, it's actually not a very strong law when it comes to covert activities. So Congress wanted to make a real strong law, and they wanted to make sure that it was enforceable by this independent board. So what the board did was they said, we want your records and we're going to make them public. But they gave the agencies the right to say, look, you don't want that guy's name out there because he fears retaliation, or that's a living source. You can redact that name, you can redact that name until that person dies, for example. And so the review board gave a lot of leeway to the agencies. They took their interests into account. It was an extremely fair process. And so that's the agencies asked for redactions, and they got them. Now, they also asked for redactions, and they didn't get them. And the review board said, no, we want to release this. And the agencies, they could have appealed to the president, but Clinton told the review board and all the agencies, don't come to us with this. Work it out among yourselves. And that had the effect of really strengthening the hand of the JFK review board, because if the agencies were saying, well, you can't possibly release this, and the board said, well, we don't buy your arguments, we're going to release it, then the agencies would have to, if they wanted to fight, they'd have to go to the president, and the president would be annoyed with them, right? Clinton had made that clear. And so the review board really got their way a lot of times, but they were also very fair and said the agency could withhold things. But the law said you could withhold things for up to 25 years. And then after 25 years, except in the rarest of cases, that was the language in the law, everything will be made public. Okay, so 1992, the law is passed. 25 years later is October 2017. And the legal issue comes to President Trump. There's all these records that have to be made public. Now, if Trump did nothing, all of the records would have become public. But Mike Pompeo and Chris Wray went to Trump and they said, look, we couldn't possibly release these 16,000 portions of 16,000 different documents. And so Trump did what Trump does. He went on Twitter and said all the JFK files have been released ahead of time, which was true except for the fact that they weren't all released, and the ones that were released behind times. So what Trump did was the agencies released some material, but he gave the CIA and the FBI 4 more years. Most of these records, by the way, are CIA and FBI records. There's some other agencies involved, but probably 80% of them are CIA documents.
So are they still hiding documents that have not been released?
We're trying to figure that out right now, like how real has the compliance been, and it's just too early to tell. But to go back to Trump and Biden, the question came to Biden in 2021 and 2022, and he basically did the same thing. He said, we're going to release some things, but the CIA has final control over the process, and they can decide when they want to release and what they want to release. So Biden really slammed the door on JFK disclosure and froze the process. When 2024 rolled around, Trump was kind of embarrassed by what he had done in 2017. And his buddies were giving him a hard time about it. Tucker Carlson and Andrew Napolitano, they were like, why didn't you release them? And Trump he never had a good answer. Oh, if you'd seen what I'd seen in there, you wouldn't have released them either. I don't know what was in there. He was very uncomfortable. He wasn't his, his usual glib, blustery self where he's got an answer for everything. And so he jumped back on the bandwagon in 2024 when RFK Jr. joined the campaign. And at their rally in August, RFK comes up and Trump says, we're going to release the JFK files. And he gets a big round of applause. And so, at that point, it was a good issue for him. It kind of sealed his alliance with RFK Jr. And he talked about it with Joe Rogan. It was part of kind of his closing argument. This is something I'm going to do. I'm going to release the JFK files, which, according to polling, is a very popular point of view. 60-70% of people say everything should be released. So that set the stage for now Trump comes in with an executive order, and the executive order is very strong. and it's a good complement to the JFK Records Act, which is still in effect, I might add. So we have a law that says all the records have to be made public by 2017. Okay, that deadline's been blown by 8 years, but what's 8 years among friends? And now Trump comes along and says we want full and complete disclosure. So the combination has forced a huge amount of material into the public record, and we're trying to get our hands and our minds around everything that's in there. But very significant revelations have already emerged, and there's going to be more. Not smoking guns, okay?
But we want the smoking guns, Jeff. Like we want to know who the hell is holding the gun. Was it Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it
Well,
the
look,
CIA? Was it the mafia?
there's no smoking gun that Oswald did it, and a smoking gun implies a common understanding of a crime scene, right? Where there's a guy holding a gun and it's smoking, and okay. Now, we don't have that, right? Nobody saw Oswald with a gun in that window. In fact, there's credible evidence that he was on the second floor at the time. So,
And not on the sixth.
and not on the sixth floor. So,
Okay.
uh, so what do what do we make of this? And what I say is don't look for a smoking gun, look for a fact pattern. Okay. And I learned this from a cop. Okay. I was covering cops at one time when I was a reporter, and I was like desperate for information. And the cops, they don't talk to you. I mean, you could talk to the sergeant, but if you were lucky, you talk to a detective. And I'd say, what about this case? And he'd say, read the docket. Read the docket, go to court, read all the court documents. So that's what you do. Read the totality of the record. What is the totality of the evidence? What is the
I was just
pattern?
gonna say that. Yeah. I was gonna ask, like, where does a fact pattern lead? Who is it leading to? Is it leading to the CIA
It's leading
with
to
their covert?
the upper echelon of the CIA. And what I reported last month and which was revealed on March 18th with the declassification of one of the documents was that James Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA in 1963, had lied to congressional investigators in 1978 about what he knew about Oswald before the assassination.
Right. We
Angleton,
had 40 pages of information on Oswald, the CIA did, right? And we
no,
knew
no,
that he
not
had traveled.
not 40, 194.
Okay.
Angleton, by November 15th, 1963, James Angleton, one of the top three guys at the CIA, had a 190-page dossier on Oswald in his office. 12 State Department reports, 12 FBI reports, 10 internal CIA memos, and a scattering of newspaper clippings and memos from others. So they had a very, very, very detailed understanding of who this guy was. Okay.
And they
You
knew
don't
he
keep a
was also
file on
in
that.
Dallas.
Um, They knew that he had gone to Mexico City and made contact with the Soviet embassy, and had the two FBI reports that Angleton received in November 1963 said that Oswald was back in Texas. So they knew that he was in the vicinity, and they knew that he had lived in Dallas and Fort Worth before. So yeah, so they knew all about him. So Angleton lied under oath. That made him the third top CIA official known to have lied about Oswald before the assassination. So when I talk about a fact pattern, that's a fact pattern. So what does that tell us? Well, lying under oath in a homicide investigation, that's malfeasance, right? That shows culpability, right? That shows guilty knowledge. That's incriminating. Okay, so that's the fact pattern that we see around the man who supposedly killed the president. Now, why are they lying? Well, the defense is, well, they were just watching him, but they weren't really running an operation involving him, right? There's nothing in the file that says we're running an operation involving this guy. Now, one point is you would never put that kind of information into a CIA file, and CIA officers know not to do that. Okay, so that's one point. But the second point is Oswald was involved in CIA operations that were not surveillance operations before the assassination. And this is one of the stories that I found in the JFK files. And it's an incredible, mind-blowing story that the CIA has never commented on because it's so egregious. And this is the story. In the summer of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald had a series of confrontations with Cuban exiles in New Orleans. And he made a big stink. He got into a fight because he was handing out pro-Castro pamphlets and they were anti-Castro. They threw his leaflets in the wind. They got into a fight and they were arrested. Okay, so that made the newspapers. There was a little item in the newspaper. Then they went to court and the Cubans confronted Oswald, the treacherous pro-Castro guy, and there was a TV news coverage of that. Oswald then handed out pamphlets again, and there was more TV coverage. Then the leaders of the Cuban Student Directorate in New Orleans challenged Oswald to a debate, and there was a radio debate, a radio interview, and then a radio debate. Okay, so as a result of Oswald's encounters with this Cuban Student Directorate, he became known for the first time as a supporter of the Cuban Revolution. What I reported, and no one disputes, is that those Cubans were funded and supported by the CIA and by this officer, George Joanides, who was the chief of covert action operations in Miami. He was not a top-level guy. He was more like a mid-level guy. Okay, Angleton's a top-level guy. Joanides is the guy who's carrying out the schemes of his bosses at the field level. Okay, so they generate propaganda about Oswald, denounce him as a pro-Castro supporter, call for a congressional investigation of him. This is all in the summer of 1963. Then on November 22nd, Oswald's arrested for killing the president, and the CIA's propaganda assets go public. And that night of Kennedy's assassination, the president's body is still in the air, returning to Washington. The CIA's media assets go out and they encourage the first JFK conspiracy theories. They say, we have proof that this guy Oswald acted at behest of Castro. President Kennedy was killed by a communist. The CIA's propaganda assets were putting that out within hours of Kennedy's death. Okay. First point, they never told the Warren Commission that the CIA funded Oswald's antagonists in New Orleans. The story that Oswald got into a fight with the Cubans, that was in the Warren report, and it was more evidence that Oswald was nuts, okay? Or that's how it was described. What the CIA didn't tell the Warren Commission was that Joanides was funding those Cubans, okay? Now here's where the story really gets interesting, Amir. 15 years later, people are still wondering, this JFK story doesn't make sense. And Congress reopens the investigation in 1978. There have been a lot of revelations about CIA abuses of power and Watergate, CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders. All that came out. And in that backlash against the CIA, Congress said, we're going to reopen the JFK investigation. Just too many people have doubts about it. So they reopen the investigation, and the congressional investigators are, they've learned a lot about the CIA that the Warren Commission never had. And so they want to ask questions. They want to interview officers and they want to look at documents. So the CIA has a liaison officer to work with the congressional investigators, right? Oh, you want to find Joe? He's retired in Florida. I'll get his number for you. That type of thing. Okay. Or you want a file from November 1963, we can get that for you and show it to you. So the CIA calls Joanides, the guy who's running the Cubans who were involved with Oswald in 1963, and they put him in charge of the liaison. So when the congressional investigators say, by the way, who was running that Cuban Student Directorate? Who was the CIA officer who was in charge of that? We'd like to talk to him. They were looking at the answer to their question. George Joanides was the guy who had run those Cubans 15 years earlier. And he was asked point blank, what do you know about this? And he said, I don't know. I'll get back to you. And he never did. with that lie, that audacious, felonious lie, the CIA completely thwarted the congressional investigation, and they never looked into this matter because they had no idea that it had happened because Joanides had plugged, had stonewalled them. It was a classic example of Stonewall. So that story, that's a story that I found in the new JFK files. And I found a lot of guys, retired Cubans in Miami, who recalled Joanides for me and told me all about him. That was a hell of a story. And to this day, it's unexplained. And one of the things that I've been pressing for in recent years, and with Congresswoman Luna now and her task force on declassification, is, where is his file? And we know it exists. I sued for it under the Freedom of Information Act and didn't get it because the CIA said it's so highly classified you can't see it. But it exists, and it will explain what was going on here. And I believe that it will explain that somebody very high in the CIA was running an operation involving Oswald, intentionally involving Oswald before the assassination. Now, was that operation part of a plot to kill the president? I mean, there's just too much secrecy to say. I mean, we need to see the file. I think that it will support what I'm saying, that there was this operation around Oswald, and that whole business in New Orleans was designed by somebody to create a legend around Oswald that he was pro-Castro, and that that's probably related to the assassination. Anyway, a very disturbing, very well documented story that the CIA has never explained. That's front and center of my JFK reporting now. That's where the story is going. So you say, so we have this fact pattern. Angleton, Joanides, and Deputy Director Richard Helms all lie about what they know about Oswald before the assassination. Like I said, that's an incriminating fact pattern. And I think what it points to is, why do CIA people lie? It's their job.
Part of the
They lie
job.
to the confidentiality of covert operations. That's the most likely explanation for why they lied. Now, the CIA has a lot of pro bono lawyers in the Washington press corps. And those pro bono lawyers are rushing forward now to say, oh, no, 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 no. Oh, this lying to about a presidential assassin, that's really no big deal because they weren't covering up anything untoward. They were lying because they were innocent. They were embarrassed that they knew all about this guy Oswald, but they just missed him. That's the argument, okay? 3 senior CIA officials lying about a presidential assassin, that can't be incompetence or inadvertence.
Right.
That's
And you have
not a
hundreds of pages
plausible
of
explanation. Yeah,
and you have
that's not
hundreds of
plausible.
pages of reporting on them.
So that
I,
where is the story going? It's going to the upper echelon of the CIA. Let me make a caution. I'm not saying there was a CIA plot. CIA, FBI, military worked covertly together. Joanides may have been working on a military intelligence operation that was not a CIA operation. So I don't say that there was a CIA plot to kill the president. I say the president was killed by his enemies, and CIA people were probably involved.
so I wanted to ask you, let's say if CIA, all of this is pointing to the CIA,
Right.
why why did they want to remove the president? Was there a conflict that they had with the president? Was
Absolutely.
it on?
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to understand the history of the Kennedy presidency. The idea that the assassination was unrelated to the president's politics. I mean, look, if the president is shot dead in broad daylight, the first assumption has to be that it has something to do with his politics, not that it's, the work of a lone madman. The presumption is that there must be a political motive. And only if you discovered there was no political motive would you resort to the less plausible explanation. And what happened was we didn't get any of the evidence that pointed to a political motive because the CIA hid it and these men lied about it. But over the years, we've learned a lot. And what we've learned is that Kennedy was in profound conflict with his national security agencies. They were very disillusioned by him First, by his refusal to invade Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The CIA had organized this invasion to overthrow Castro. It went badly, and Kennedy didn't come to their rescue. So the Cubans in Miami felt betrayed.
But
Okay.
didn't he authorize the approval of the Bay of Pigs?
Yes, he did. He had. And what he said was, look, um, you're on your own, you know, if this can succeed without betraying the hand of the US government, then fine, go ahead. Can it succeed without doing that? And the Joint Chiefs said yes, and the CIA said yes. The whole thing went south in 24 hours. And he was like, you handed me a crappy plan. No, I'm not going to come and bail you out. I told you I wasn't going to bail you out. So no, I'm not going to do it. So anyway, people felt very betrayed by Kennedy because he had approved the plan. A year and a half later, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and Kennedy alienates the Joint Chiefs by refusing to invade and attack Cuba immediately. And instead of going to war, Kennedy negotiates a peaceful settlement that avoids nuclear war. And Kennedy's statesmanship in the Cuban Missile Crisis cannot be understated. He saved the human race, and it was pretty much up to him. If he had listened to his generals and invaded, the Soviet Union, the generals said, look, just invade. They don't have nuclear weapons yet, and we've got overwhelming force. We'll just crush them. They only have, in the Soviet Union, they only have 12,000 troops on the island. The 82nd Airborne can wipe them out easily. Okay. What the Joint Chiefs didn't know was that the Soviets didn't have 12,000 troops on the island. They had 45,000. And they didn't know that the Soviet commanders in the field had tactical battle nuclear weapons. And their instructions were they could only fire the nuclear weapons with authorization from Moscow or if they themselves came under attack. Okay. Otherwise, they could not fire their weapons. If the US had invaded, they would have used their nuclear weapons. And US doctrine at that point would have required massive retaliation against, I think, 50 cities in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, their doctrine was if we get hit by a nuclear attack, we'll attack 50 cities in the US. Okay. So if Kennedy had succumbed to the advice of his generals, we would have had a nuclear war that killed 10, 20 million people. I mean, the world would have been disfigured forever. And in the deliberations about what to do, Kennedy called together all of his advisors. There were about 24 people from different State Department, Defense Department, CIA, personal advisors, called them together. And when the crisis first started, when they realized the Soviet Union were building missile bases in Cuba, he took a poll. What should we do? And the vote on the first day, I think the vote was 15-9 to attack. Okay. Kennedy, the president, was in the minority. If Kennedy had gone with the majority, we would have had a nuclear war and 20 million people would have been killed. He held out because he said, we don't know what we don't know. Like the generals were very confident, we'll blow them away. Kennedy was like, no, I don't want to do that. So he negotiates his way to a peaceful settlement, shoots up in the polls because people were scared to death, and rightly so. The world was probably 48 hours from a nuclear war. And at the height of the missile crisis, this is a story that came out later. At the height of the missile crisis, Kennedy sends RFK, his brother, to see Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador here in Washington. And RFK goes to him and says, look, Mr. Ambassador, we're not negotiating anymore. We've offered you this deal. You move the missiles out, we won't invade, and we'll end this thing. We're not talking anymore. If the president has to go on much longer, he may be overthrown in a military coup. And we know this because Dobrynin went back and reported it to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev wrote about it in his memoirs, which were later published in 1970. So Kennedy was facing a military coup, and he pulled it off. and he shot up in the polls. He was lauded as a statesman, a man who had pulled the world back from the brink of war. And he learned a lesson, which was how crazy it was that he was going to go to war over Cuba, a strategically unimportant country, tiny, no threat to the United States. With the missiles gone, it was, there was no problem. The generals were furious, and that doesn't quite capture it. The generals thought that Kennedy had the advantage and he had given it away to the communists. So he was actually helping the communists. That was the belief among the upper echelon of the Pentagon and the CIA. It wasn't just that Kennedy was weak. It was that he was really like a traitor. And he had betrayed the Cubans, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in 1963, Kennedy becomes a much more dovish president. Okay. And early in his first year in office, he'd been kind of a conventional Cold Warrior. In 1963, and this is the part that people should really study about the Kennedy presidency, because it is why the president is remembered, is his actions at the Bay of Pigs, at the Cuban Missile Crisis and after. In March of 1963, he cracks down on Cuban exiles who are attacking boats going to the Soviet Union. He's turning down the heat on Castro, searching for ways of accommodation with Castro, much to the fury of the CIA and the Pentagon. In June, he gives a speech at American University here in Washington, which people should watch, where he calls for a strategy for peace. And he says, we need to end this Cold War. The people of the Soviet Union are human, just like we are. And we need a way to live with our differences and not be on the brink of war all the time. In September, he forces through a limited test ban treaty over the unanimous opposition of his generals, a kind of confidence building measure where if you couldn't test your nuclear weapons, you'd be less sure that they would work. And so you'd be less likely to use them. It wasn't a big deal, but at the time, it was an important symbolic first step. How can these two nuclear superpowers, with aggressive ideological visions for the world, how can they live with each other? And Kennedy's trying to establish that. Well, all of that was anathema to the people in the CIA and the Pentagon. And this hatred of Kennedy by the fall of '63, was quite visceral. And another thing that we've learned over the years, that we learned from the release of the JFK files, is that there definitely was a conspiratorial, anti-democratic mindset in the upper echelons of the Pentagon. And we know that because in May 1963, they approved something called Operation North Woods. And if you're interested in this subject, I highly recommend the website of the Mary Farrell Foundation. Mary, M-A-R-Y, Farrell, F-E-R-R-E-L-L, maryfarrell.org. That's the website of the Mary Farrell Foundation, and it's the host of the largest online collection of JFK assassination records, as well as RFK and MLK assassination records. And that's where you can learn about this. And they have an especially good introduction to Operation North Woods. Operation North Woods was the Pentagon's solution to the Cuba problem, right? Kennedy didn't invade. He wasn't going to invade. The idea that there'd be an internal coup, that somehow Castro's domestic enemies would force him out, that wasn't going to happen. He was too popular. His security forces were too strong. So how do you get rid of Castro? So the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved Operation North Woods on May 1st, 1963. And North Woods was what they call in the business a pretext operation, or an engineered provocation is another term that's used for it. The term you probably hear most often is false flag operation. Okay. So I like engineered provocation because the false flag operation sounds a little spooky, and it's like a pirate, skull and bones on the black flag. An engineered provocation. That's a little more precise description of what they were doing. And here's how it would work. The US would stage a spectacular attack on an American target. And that could be, and the Pentagon worked out these various scenarios. That could be a terror attack in Washington was one scenario. A plane hijacking was another scenario. There were a couple of plane hijacking scenarios. Another one was this was when the U.S. was sending up its first astronauts. If John Glenn's first space mission had ended in disaster and Glenn was killed, the CIA was prepared to fake evidence that Cuba was responsible, that somehow they'd interfered with the flight. So you staged a spectacular attack on an American target, and you use your most trusted personnel, your most trusted covert personnel. That's the language in the Northwoods document. And you use your most trusted covert personnel to arrange for the blame to fall on Cuba. So you stage the spectacular attack, but you make it look like Castro did it. And then, oh, look, the lawless Castro outside the community of peace-loving nations. Can you imagine the horrible thing that he did? The president now has justification to order the invasion of Cuba. That was the Joint Chiefs solution, the Northwoods solution. So basically, to trick the country into going to war. That was the mentality. And the Northwoods plans were approved unanimously by the Joint Chiefs on May 1st. And they stayed in effect until September 29th, 1963. So in that time, that's what Pentagon and CIA people were doing. They were preparing to stage some kind of spectacular attack in the United States and blame it on Cuba. So on November 22nd, somebody staged a spectacular attack on an American target, and immediately the CIA's most trusted covert personnel spring into action to blame the crime on Cuba. So is that suspicious? Well, the fact that Northwoods was totally unknown, nobody disclosed it to any assassination investigation, was proof that nobody wanted that story on the record, not while people were investigating Kennedy's death. So the Northwoods document was along with the Joanides files, one of the most significant new pieces of evidence that we have. And, when I say the CIA's covert assets immediately sprung into view, that's abundantly documented. That's not a theory. That actually happened. So what does that tell you? That tells you that anti-democratic conspiratorial mindset was quite common. Approved. But that wasn't, it was policy in 1963. So, this is the accumulating evidence that we're getting. And it's adding up.
Yeah, I feel like I'm back in history class and I could just sit here and listen to you talk
Yeah.
about this all day long. But
Yeah.
Jeff, this,
Yeah. Okay. So where do you want to go with it?
yeah,
What do you
I
want
was
to know?
just gonna, my follow-up to all that is there is so much evidence that there is a deep state out there uh, that has that has these covert operations, intelligent operations to undermine uh, the president, the country, um, so their policies aren't to maybe undermine their policies.
Okay. So the language of the deep state, that's very charged because, Trump says if you criticize him, you're part of the deep state, right? Like, um, now people used to say military industrial complex.
Complex.
Uh, 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 I like the term the secret agencies, okay? Because that to me that's more factual. There's 18 intelligence agencies in the US government that have the powers of secrecy. Their budgets, their actions are pretty covert. You and I can't find out about them very easily. Maybe members of Congress can, but So, it's really an unaccountable part of the government. And certainly in the early 1960s, the CIA operated as a state within a state. And, the deep state is not an inaccurate description of what they were. Um, that did change a little bit in the 1970s, late 1970s, with the reforms of the Watergate Congress. And the CIA was put under a little bit more control. And so the idea that the state was operating without oversight from the government, uh, the reforms, they weren't hugely significant. They didn't result in a lot of drag on what the CIA wanted to do. But this idea that the CIA, is in conflict with the president, not necessarily. The CIA is out to maximize its own power. And if presidents go along with that, then that's fine. Like Reagan and Obama, you know, they they liked the CIA, liked what it did for them. And so the CIA didn't work at cross purposes with them. Um, Other presidents, they did. Kennedy, certainly, Nixon, Carter, um, and Trump, where there was a lot of conflict between the CIA and the White House. So, um, but, the JFK story is, I think, fascinating and compelling to people because it's exhibit A in this discourse, right? Is there a deep state? Are these agencies beyond the control of the people? Do they have their own agenda? Well, the JFK case is an acid test. If we can't get all the records about this case, a president getting shot in broad daylight, like what hope do we
On
have?
national TV. All right.
Yeah, no, it wasn't on TV. The movie that was taken of the motorcade did not emerge for 12 years.
Oh, okay. Did not know
Which
that.
Yeah, no, which is an important thing and very hard, I think, for younger people to understand. When somebody took a shot at Trump, we had like 200 cell phone, versions of the crime, within the hour. Um,
Right.
oh, the film that a bystander, Abraham Zapruder, took of the gunfire of the motorcade. He was filming the motorcade when the gunfire erupted. That film was not shown publicly until 1975. Still pictures were taken from it, frames were shown from it, but in its entirety, it was not broadcast on national TV until 1975, 12 years later. So uh, that's that was a big factor in why the government reopened the investigation in the 1970s was when people saw that film.
Where does Jack Ruby play a part in all this?
So Jack Ruby, Oswald is arrested. He vehemently denies killing the president. And I think those denials are credible. There's really no evidence that Oswald had any animus towards the president. The Warren Commission never established a motive, even though they convicted him of the crime. Um, so, and Oswald said, I'm just a patsy, right? Like, that's an interesting formulation because he's saying, not only did I not do it, but there's somebody else who's blaming it on me. And so that was a startling claim. And the next day, when he's being led out of the jail cell and taken to another jail, a man steps out of the crowd and shoots him dead. That was Jack Ruby. Now, according to the Warren Commission, he was just a disgruntled businessman who was distraught about the assassination and wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial. That was the story Ruby told. In fact, Jack Rubenstein, had come up as a foot soldier in the Chicago mob under the tutelage of Sam Giancana. He was the successor to Al Capone. And this was a very brutal crime syndicate based in Chicago. Ruby grew up in that milieu and then moved to Dallas and bought a strip club and hung out with cops and organized crime figures. He routinely beat up people in his bar, supplied drinks to the cops, was an FBI informant, and basically an organized crime wannabe. the notion that he killed Oswald out of some sentiment about female sensibilities, I mean, that is truly laughable. Jack Ruby's best friend was a dog. He never married. He ran a strip club. He was a bruiser, a brawler, you know. And I talked to one of the women who worked in his club who was friends with him. And I said, why did your friend kill Oswald? And her answer was very telling. She said, I don't think he had a choice. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well,
Yeah, what does that mean?
everybody works for somebody, you know, like, and Jack worked for people. And like who? She said, I don't know. I was just a 20-year-old kid, you know, like, but that was her conviction. And she knew Ruby pretty well. She also said, I said, well, what did he think about President Kennedy? She said, I never heard him say word one about President Kennedy, but I will tell you one thing. He hated Bobby Kennedy with a purple passion. Okay. So the Warren Commission's portrait of this, you know, kind of bumbling businessman, concerned, weepy about Jackie Kennedy was totally false, you know. And that's another reason why, you know, and so critics of the Warren Commission started putting this out right away. And it was like, it was obviously false. They, you know, they averted their eyes. And, you know, the Warren Commission critics, I mean, they pointed out how terrible the investigation was. Earl Warren went to Dallas to interview Ruby. He was in jail. And there's film of this. And Ruby says, take me to Washington and I'll tell you the story. Right? Obviously, he didn't feel safe in Dallas, right? He just killed a guy in police custody. He knew he wasn't safe. He said, take me to Washington and I'll tell you the story. Earl Warren wouldn't do it because Earl Warren didn't want to know. And so Ruby never talked. So, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, what was the organized crime role in the plot? You know, did organized crime do it? We know organized crime's role in the JFK plot. Their role was to eliminate the witness. And I was on Piers Morgan with a guy named Michael Franzine, who was he was a mafia capo. You know, he was a made man. He hung out with these guys for years. And now he turned state's witness and he's kind of like, you know, a mafia guy on TV. And he said, you know, when I was in the mob, it was common knowledge. What did we do in the JFK thing? We were asked to take care of Oswald and we did. So that's the organized crime role in the plot. It's right there. Jack Ruby killing Oswald is. Now, did they organize the gunfire in Dealey Plaza?
Can we play that video of Jack Ruby?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There's Oswald coming out. He looks like he's all beaten up. This looks like it's primetime TV, Jeff.
Oh, yes. This was primetime TV. This was the assassination of Kennedy was. Yeah. I think it's the first homicide that was ever nationally broadcast.
Wow. So you said from there they caught Ruby and then they took him to prison and where he was being questioned, and then he said he said, "Oh, bring me to Washington, D.C. and I'll tell you all about it." Why was he not brought? Like, what happened to Jack Ruby at?
He remained in jail. He was convicted. Then he pleaded insanity, and his case was on appeal. And he got cancer, and he died in 1967, and never talked. What, you know,
Wow.
why didn't Earl Warren take him back to Washington? I mean, this is where the critics of the Warren Commission totally scored. I mean, completely, you know, that was the obvious thing you should do, is get that guy in a safe place and ask him, why did he do this? And they wouldn't do it because they didn't want the answer. They decided on day one, we're not going to do this communist plot. We're not going to say that. We're just going to say this one guy alone did it. And Johnson and Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, the new president, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, decided within hours of the film you just saw, they both decided and told aides, we have to convince the public that Oswald, now conveniently dead, was the only man behind this, and nobody else was involved. Okay. The president hasn't been buried. The investigation's barely begun, and they have settled on the solution that people will still tell you to this day. Oh, yes, Oswald killed that one guy killed the president for no reason. Johnson and Hoover decided that on day one. The Warren Commission rubber stamped that 10 months later. And with all the evidence that we see now, it's just that's not what happened. And the fact that they set out to convict Oswald right away is pretty strong evidence that they knew that that wasn't happening and that they didn't want a real investigation, because a real investigation would have shown the CIA was all over Oswald, right? If that the story that I published earlier this year, that the CIA had a 194-page file on Oswald, that James Angleton had a 194-page file on the guy who just killed the president, James Angleton would have lost his job. The CIA might have been abolished, and instead nobody knew anything about it. And Angleton kept his job for 10 more years.
Didn't JFK wanted to break up the CIA at one point?
Yes, after the Bay of Pigs, and this is one of the documents that just came out that's very important. And anybody who says there's nothing in the new JFK files, go read the Arthur Schlesinger memo, and you will see that that claim is false. The Arthur Schlesinger memo is a startling look at a reality that the CIA took pains to hide for 60 years. Okay. We never had this document until March 18th. And it was a memo called Reorganizing the CIA. So after the Bay of Pigs invasion went south, right, the invaders were defeated. Kennedy didn't come to their rescue. He suffered a humiliating defeat as well. He was furious, and that was when privately, it's widely quoted, Kennedy said, "I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds," right? He was really angry. Well, when he calmed down, he asked his aide, Arthur Schlesinger, a historian and a former intelligence officer, what do we do about the CIA? And so Schlesinger writes a very cogent 15-page memo about why the CIA should be reorganized. And basically, Schlesinger's argument was the CIA is encroaching on the president's foreign policy, ability to make foreign policy. So that memo was made public in the 1990s. But those of us who were interested in JFK records noticed there was an entire page missing, completely redacted, a little bit, page and a half in the middle of the memo. What was that about? Well, after Trump did his declassification, the CIA declassified one more line in the memo. And the line said, it was the first line of this section of the paper. And it was called The Problem with Controlled American Sources, CAS. And then a page and a half of redaction. So what's a controlled American source? Controlled American source is CIA officers under official cover, right? That means it's a source of intelligence that we totally control. Okay, it's not like a freelance agent. That's called an illegal, somebody who's just out there unaffiliated and doesn't have government cover. But so on March 18th, we got that page that was missing. And it's a fascinating page because it shows what Kennedy was up against and what the CIA did not want anybody to know. And what the CIA fully intended to keep secret and only had to release it because of President Trump's order. And that Schlesinger was absolutely right. The CIA was encroaching on the president's ability to make foreign policy. One of the lines that was censored was, Schlesinger said, on the day of your inauguration, Mr. President, 47% of State Department political officers worldwide were in fact CIA officers. He said in the Paris embassy, there's 123 people who work for the CIA. I mean, those numbers surprised even those of us who know the CIA well. I would have thought 50, 75 people in Paris, but 125, that's a lot. Almost 50% of State Department officers worldwide were actually CIA officers. No wonder Kennedy felt hemmed in by these people. And he wanted to do something about it. And there's even more in that part that they left out. And this is where it's very relevant to Kennedy. Schlesinger observed that it was common knowledge in Paris that the CIA station was on the top floor of the US Embassy. In July 1961, Charles de Gaulle was the president of France. He faced down a military coup from his own generals. His right-wing generals wanted to keep the French colony of Algeria. And de Gaulle realized he had to let it go. The French could not colonize this country. They wanted independence. The mostly Arab population wanted independence, and France just had to give it up. And so Algeria was for France kind of like what Vietnam was for America. It was a conflict that tore the country apart, deeply divided the country, passionate feelings on both sides. In the memo, in Schlesinger's memo, he says, on the night of the general's coup, so the generals attempt to mount a coup, and de Gaulle calls his favorite generals, and they put this rebellion down. But, they were trying to overthrow de Gaulle. And in the memo, Schlesinger says, everybody in France said that the lights on the top floor of the embassy, the CIA station, were on all night. And de Gaulle came to believe that the CIA station in Paris was witting to this effort to overthrow him. That was July 1961. In August 1962, de Gaulle is going to his country house outside of Paris when his limousine is ambushed by these same forces, right wing, who oppose his Algeria policy. De Gaulle, unlike Kennedy, had a very skillful driver, and the driver steered around the ambush. The car was laced with gunfire, but de Gaulle was unhurt. De Gaulle also thought that the CIA was witting to that assassination. And so what the CIA was hiding was the fact that a US ally believed that the CIA was complicit in assassination attempts against them. That's what they wanted to hide. Now, was that national security information that had to be withheld for 60 years? No. That was information that was embarrassing to the CIA and would hurt the CIA if it ever came out. And so that's something that we just learned. And what we learned on March 18th was the forces that were around Kennedy and how they were encroaching on him. And the Schlesinger memo is the origin story of the alienation between the CIA and the White House in the Kennedy years. And that alienation would continue until Kennedy died.
I feel like all these connections you're making, it's very clear that these agencies very much have an agenda.
Yeah.
And that agenda is maybe to undermine the president or the country of its foreign policies, to overthrow governments. Wow.
I mean, for presidents who share the CIA's agenda, they don't
They work
necessarily.
hand in hand. Right.
Yeah,
Right. They work
yeah.
hand in hand.
I mean, you know, if the CIA doesn't have the confidence of the president, they're really just a high-powered university, with an army, in the back lot twiddling their thumbs. If they don't have the ability for the president to say, let's do this or let's do that, then if the president ignores them, so their agenda is to get the president on their page, and they can do that.
And I don't mean to say like there aren't real threats out there. We certainly do have these. I do believe these intelligent communities should exist. They are there for a purpose, which is to obviously protect America and American interest. Do you think we'll ever get to the truth when it comes to the JFK files?
I think we will. I think we will.
Do you think we're close?
Yeah, I mean, here's an analogy I use a lot. And that's the story of the affair between President Thomas Jefferson and an enslaved woman whom he owned, Sally Hemings. Do you know this story?
I don't.
Okay. This was rumored in Jefferson's lifetime. It was the first sex scandal in American politics. In 1800, Jefferson's opponents circulated the rumor, the story that Jefferson had a slave mistress, Dusky Sally, they called her, and he was attacked savagely for it, and he didn't respond. And over the years, people said, he had children with her, and Jefferson's defenders said there was nothing to it. And the Hemings family, though, who were owned by the Jeffersons, and some of whom were freed, in their family, it was common knowledge that Thomas Jefferson was the father of some of Sally Hemings' children. James Hemings was Sally's brother, was Jefferson's cook, and Sally was a servant in the house. So there was this controversy, and nobody really knew, and nobody really listened to the Hemings family. And so, as recently as 50 years ago, 1976, a guy won a Pulitzer Prize for a history about Jefferson and slavery, in which he said, this story of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, it's a conspiracy theory, it's a rumor, it's a smear, there's nothing to it. No serious person would believe this. And at that time, if you had, polled the experts, opinion makers, the editors of the New York Times, thought leaders in America, you would have gotten 95% assent that that was ridiculous. There was nothing to it. It was just something ginned up by Jefferson's enemies. Okay. Today, there's really no debate at all. Everybody's pretty certain that Thomas Jefferson indeed had a relationship with Sally Hemings and was the father of 5 of her children. So within 50 years, the expert opinion totally flipped. And right now, you have this situation where people say confidently, this Kennedy assassination is just a bunch of rumors. It's un-American, Oliver Stone, how terrible, and all of that. And I just think that, that's going to totally flip. And it's going to totally flip for the same reasons that it flipped in the case of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Why did it change in 50 years? Well, the first thing was in the 60s and 70s, attitudes changed, right? The old racist attitude, well, don't listen to what the Hemings say because they're Black people and they're untrustworthy, so their story couldn't possibly be true. Well, people went, and the Hemings, they had it was in their Bible, it was in the family's oral history, it was handed down. Sally Hemings' children were very light-skinned. In fact, one of them eventually passed for white. So attitudes changed, and historians in the 70s, first time Fawn Brodie wrote a history and said that Jefferson really did have this relationship. So attitudes changed. New evidence emerged in the form of the Hemings family history, right? The new attitudes led to new evidence. People went and found an interview with a newspaper in the 1870s where one of the Hemings descendants told the story. Oh yeah, Thomas Jefferson, that was my grandfather, So new attitudes led to new evidence, and then new technology came along, DNA technology. And so they tested the descendants of the Hemings and the Jefferson, and it became clear that a Jefferson was the father of the 5 Hemings, of Sally's 5 children. And if you took the birth dates of those children, which we had, and subtracted 9 months, Thomas Jefferson was in the presence of Sally Hemings for all 5 of the times she became pregnant. So new attitudes, new evidence, new technology, and the conventional wisdom totally changed 100%. And now it's not really a subject of argument anymore. So
Fascinating.
New attitudes lead to new evidence and new technology can have a revolutionary effect. And I think that's what's going to happen with JFK. We've got new attitudes. The idea that our CIA would never do something like that. We have a new attitude now. Yes, the CIA could do something like that. New evidence. We've got all these files coming out. And we've got new technology. I mean, and I'm not talking just about AI, although we are interested in that, but the networked digital world is the new technology. The ability to search these records we can search these records incredibly rapidly compared to even 30 years ago. So new attitudes, new evidence, new technology is going to lead to a new interpretation of Kennedy's assassination. Will it
Are there
happen
any
in?
pictures? Sorry,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, are there any pictures of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings or like from maybe and their kids potentially? Or then if like if we were to Google them, would we be able to find some pictures, some drawings? And if so, Russ, can you
Oh,
maybe look them up?
okay. Jefferson died in 1826. There wasn't photography till about 1840. Same with Sally Hemings. So there was no photography in their lifetime.
Mhm.
Um, but the story of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson is the subject of a very good book by historian Annette Gordon Reed. And she tells the story of how it came to light and how the conventional wisdom changed. And she was writing in the 90s, right as the DNA technology was being perfected and the DNA analysis clinched the case. But she lays out the transformation of elite thinking about this and how it happened. How was it that it was denied for so long? Racism, political favoritism, uh, uh, and how it eventually came out. So, yeah, I think that's going to happen. I don't know if it's in my lifetime, but I think it definitely could happen in my lifetime.
It better be, Jeff, because we want to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, hey, I'm content. I have given my piece. I've advanced the story. Um,
You have.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and I mean, I take credit for all of this. I mean, not routinely, but with you in the privacy of our conversation. Nobody cared about these records in the mainstream media until I started making a fuss about it in 2017. Trump thought he could lie about it and get away with it. We held his feet to the fire, and he got embarrassed, and he had to do something about it. And I mean, Oliver Stone got the law passed. He deserves the most credit. But I came along and kept this story alive, and it's still alive right now. So, I
Yeah.
feel good. Like we're making a lot of progress. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there you go. There's Sally Hemings, was
Yeah.
an enslaved woman in mixed race held by President Thomas Jefferson. According to the New York Times, there is a growing historical consensus among the scholars that as a widow, Jefferson had a long-term relationship with Hemings. Okay, there, wow.
Six
That's
children.
really cool.
Yeah.
That is very,
So,
very cool.
right. So that, this is a good example. This is a very good example of how people should think about this. How a story becomes encrusted with mythology, shaped by outside interests like politics and racism, and then how the truth eventually comes out. And so, and the argument about Hemings, Jefferson and Hemings was very much like the Kennedy thing, which was like, oh, that couldn't possibly happen in America. Thomas Jefferson was this, he didn't like slavery, but he would never have done that. I was like, yeah, he did do it. And so it's like the idea about the CIA would never do anything like, ambush a president. No, well, just look at the evidence, just look at the accumulating evidence. So we're at that. I think the Sally Hemings thing crystallized into a new consensus in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think we're going to undergo that same process on JFK. Might not happen in my lifetime, might happen later this year. So stay tuned.
I'm gonna go with the latter. It happening this year.
Let's
Um,
hope. Let's hope.
you mentioned you again worked or you dove into some of the CIA files earlier on, and you've worked with some of these guys and gals. What is it like working with the CIA? And I wanted to quickly tell you, when I was in college, I applied for the CIA. I applied to be a clandestine officer because I
Uh-huh.
was watching too many Mission Impossible movies, and I was like, this looks really cool. I want to do this work. And I remember uh, making a mistake on the application and getting a call the next day, and I was on campus. I was like, what is this area code? I've never received. It was like redacted. It was like DC. like some weird area code, and I was like, I pick up and it's like, "Hi, I'm Sally from the CIA. We've noticed that you missed something on your application. Can you please go in and fix it?" And I was like, "Holy crap!" So, so that's my encounter with the CIA.
So yeah, my dealings with them, I mean, they're arrogant, they're obtuse. They're, I sued them under the Freedom of Information Act
Right,
for Joe
you
Needy's
mentioned
phone.
that. Yeah,
And after about 8 years, I was like, I'm so sick of this crap. Maybe we can just mediate a deal. Like, I'm not asking for a lot. I was asking for a couple hundred documents. I said, look, I'll cut it down to 30. Okay. So instead of asking for 200 documents, just give me 30, and can we make a deal? So we go into mediation. We go and meet the CIA lawyers, and like, they wouldn't even shake my hand. You know, their contempt for me was visible. And I said, look, guys, you work for me. Okay. I'm a taxpayer. So don't act like this is illegitimate. There's a law
right,
here, and we're trying to solve this. And they were like, they were so offended by that you would question, that I would question them about
right.
JFK. They were deeply offended. And their counteroffer was, I said, okay, I'll cut mine from 30 to what's your counteroffer? And they said, we'll give you one half of one document. That was their idea of a compromise. I walked out. So that's what they were like in court.
Yeah,
Now, you know, I've known a lot of people who worked for the CIA, and some of them are great people.
yeah.
Uh, there was a guy in my family. He's by marriage. Uh, my brother-in-law's father is the best way I could put it. Um, was a CIA guy, and he was a great guy. I interviewed him several times. He was very thoughtful about the agency and all that. He didn't betray any secrets,
Yeah,
and I'm sure he was involved in a lot of dirty tricks. But there's a lot of good people in the CIA, and
right.
in my books, I don't know, I've interviewed 50, 60 people who were CIA employees. So I don't have a prejudice against them.
Yeah.
You know.
Jeff, JFK obviously once said he's famous for this quote, don't ask what your country could do for you, but ask what you could do for your country. And I feel like that's exactly what you're doing here is you're doing exactly what I think he would have wanted you to do is get to the bottom, get to the truth. Um, I
Yeah,
obviously really appreciate
and
your time too.
you know what's gratifying to me, Amir? People come up and tell me that all the time. They say, "Thank you for doing what you're doing." The the president was denied justice. There was no justice in that case, and we
Right.
think it's important. And way more people, 30, 40 times, people come up and say that to me, come up to me and say, "You're nuts. There's nothing there." Seriously, 30 to 40 times. Now, you know, people who think that you're nuts may not come up and say it to you, but I have no doubt that the vast majority of people think that what I'm doing is justified and needed,
Yes,
and that keeps me going.
absolutely.
That keeps me going. I feel good. That makes me feel good, and that's okay. Good. I'm on the right path. I'm doing the right thing. I can feel fine about this. I can take all the crap that people are going to give me because people want me to do this.
Yeah. So I'm kind of conspiratorial myself, and the last guest I had on this podcast, he is a big 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and I would kind of push back with him a little bit on a few things. I had told him about I said I'm having Jeff Morley come on the podcast. Is there any questions you wanted me to ask him? And he wanted me to ask you, when will this stop? When will uh, this again, charged word, deep state, intelligence undermining?
Yeah. I mean, so one way to answer the question is, who do I think was responsible for 9/11? Was it a conspiracy? Yeah, it was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy organized by this guy, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, an engineer from Pakistan. And it was bankrolled by this guy, Osama bin Laden, who had a lot of money from his family. And, that's what happened. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Osama bin Laden both proudly took credit for it. So the idea that 9/11 was not the work of the man who took credit for it and the men who organized it, I don't find that very credible. Um, I do think that there's aspects of the 9/11 story that are not known and that could change that perspective. Particularly the story that a bunch of FBI agents have told, which is that um,
They
the
knew
CIA,
about some of the,
yeah, they let two of
yeah,
the hijackers into the country in January 2000, and they didn't tell the FBI. And the FBI guys are, I mean, to say they go ballistic implies that their anger might subside. They're furious about it to this day and say those guys have blood on their hands. What was going on there? Good question. Could that have been like a false flag operation? I mean, that's so speculative. I just say, to me, the evidence suggests that 9/11 was an attack organized by these two guys. And
right.
that's that was that was the they were the intellectual authors of 9/11.
Yeah. It was kind of funny because I would push back on that and he would revert to, well, if you take a $20 bill and you fold it, you'll see the Twin Towers in the back being lit on fire. I'm like,
Yeah, right. Yeah, so like people find evidence for what they want to believe. Now, I haven't studied. I mean, I read the 9/11 report. I read a lot of the related documentation about that, and things have been declassified since then. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it by any means, but that's my reading of 9/11.
Jeff, thank you for your time. Where can people find you and your work?
So, yeah, if you're interested in what I'm talking about, I publish JFK Facts on Substack, jfkfacts.substack.com. And JFK Facts, as its name suggests, is a newsletter about the latest developments in the JFK assassination story and about the secrecy that still surrounds it. So, if you're interested in conspiracy theories, probably not your place. We don't really talk about them much. They're not very important to us. If you're interested in what actually happened and what we're learning about what actually happened, it's the best place on the internet for you. And if you're interested in my work, I have 3 books about the CIA. They're not JFK books and they're not conspiracy books, but they're about 3 leading men in the CIA. And I recommend them to people. Yeah, here you go, who want to know about how the CIA worked at that time. The Ghost is the story of James Angleton, one of the men who lied about what he knew about Oswald before the assassination. Scorpion's Dance is about the relationship between Richard Nixon and Richard Helms. Richard Nixon, the 8th director of the CIA, Richard Helms, 35th president. And JFK plays a role in their very Machiavellian relationship. And then Our Man in Mexico is about Win Scott, who was the chief of the CIA station in Mexico and had Oswald under surveillance and played a leading role in the investigation, the Warren Commission investigation, and also wrote a memoir later in life saying that he believed Kennedy had been killed by a conspiracy. So those 3 books will really give you a ground level, bird's eye view of the CIA at the time of Kennedy's assassination. Like I said, none of these books is a conspiracy book. I don't pass judgment about who was responsible for the assassination in any of them. But you do see the event through the eyes of these men. When I wrote these books, I thought, Jeff, your theory, who cares about your JFK theory? Nobody, right? And nobody should care about it. You were in kindergarten at the time. But what did Richard Helms think about Kennedy's assassination? What did James Angleton think? What did Win Scott think? That's a really interesting story. All 3 men.
Jeff, sorry,
What did they
I
think
had
about who killed JFK? And if you read these,
yeah.
yeah, if you read these three
Sorry.
books, you'll understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I had one question I totally forgot to ask you, which was this
Okay.
is a very bleak question. Um, because you're a great arbiter to the truth when it comes to the JFK stuff. Have you ever felt unsafe or fear of your life because what you're trying to expose is a very real thing? Because you're fighting against these entities that have billions of dollars and endless budgets and thousands of covert operations that they're running all the time.
You know, I don't worry. Um, the only thing that makes me worried is how often people ask me this question now, and maybe I should be worried. But you know what? Look, first of all, if I have information, I put it out right away. There's no secret. Okay. So if somebody wants to kill some secret about JFK by killing me, I mean, everything I know is out there practically. I mean, there's only a few things that I've never published, for whatever reason, and they're not germane to this. So that's one thing. The second thing is, if it were true, what could I do about it? Nothing. So to me, it's like it's very easy to get paranoid, and being paranoid is very self-important. Like, Jeff, are you really so important that in this story that somebody's going to kill you? I don't think so. There's a lot of people working on JFK case. There's a lot of people who know a lot, and even a few who know more than I do. So I just think I don't worry about it because that's the better way to live. you know, it's just
Yeah,
easier. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for answering that question.
Yes.
And this is your stuff, JFK facts.
Yeah. So you can sign up for free and you get maybe half the articles for free. And then if you pay the astronomical sum of $5 a month, you can get a lot of original reporting that you cannot find anywhere else. So it's a bargain, really.
Jeff, thank you for coming on. This was a pleasure having you on.
Amir, likewise, when will this be publicly available?
Every Tuesday is when I release new episodes, so I have a few episodes in the queue. If not next week, it'll be the week after that.
Okay. Let me know and I'll post it on JFK Facts. We've got 20,000 subscribers, so we'll send a few people your way.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.